My grandma's deathbed confession changed everything. When I sat by my grandma's bed that night, I thought I was only there to say goodbye. Instead, I left with a truth I wished I'd never heard. It started a week before she passed away. Grandma had been in hospice care, slipping in and out of consciousness, her frail hands clasped over an old, faded photograph of herself as a young woman, standing next to a tall man with a stern face. We'd all wondered who he was, but no one dared to ask. Grandma was a secretive woman who rarely shared stories of her past, especially about anything before she married Grandpa. But as the days wore on and her health deteriorated, she began muttering strange things under her breath, as if fragments of memories were surfacing against her will. At first, it was just little things. She'd mumble about the red house on Elm Street or mention names we'd never heard before. The nurses said it was common for the elderly to talk to people they'd known long ago, even if they weren't around anymore. But there was something about her tone, something almost afraid. And on the night she finally woke up, truly woke up, she asked me to stay. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Before I go." I leaned closer, expecting some sweet sentiment about how much she loved me or some gentle words of advice. Instead, she grabbed my hand with a surprisingly firm grip, her eyes sharp and more alive than I'd seen in days. "I did something unforgivable," she said, staring at me with such intensity that I couldn't look away. I felt my heart start to pound. Grandma had always been a reserved woman, quiet and somewhat stern, but not secretive, at least not like this. What could she have done that was so terrible? "Do you remember the basement?" she asked. Of course, I did. Growing up, the basement of Grandma's house had always been off limits. I thought it was just one of her quirks after all. She had a lot of strict rules. But now, I could see there was something darker behind it. "Yes, I remember. You never let us go down there," I replied, my voice barely steady. She nodded slowly, her gaze growing distant. "There's a reason for that. Something happened down there. Something that changed everything." Then, she told me, when Grandma was a young woman, barely out of her teens, she had been engaged to a man named Henry. He was her first love, and according to her, the most passionate, intense relationship she'd ever had. But Henry had a temper, one that made him unpredictable. She tried to ignore the warning signs, chalking it up to his strong personality, until the night he struck her during an argument. "I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been," she said, her voice trembling as she recounted the incident. "But he apologized and promised he'd never do it again. And I believed him." They went on with their relationship. But the arguments became more frequent, his anger more volatile. Finally, Grandma decided to end things. She was ready to leave him, but he wouldn't accept it. One night, he showed up at her parents' house in a drunken rage, pounding on the door and demanding to see her. When she refused, he broke in. Her parents were out of town, and she was alone. The confrontation turned violent, and in the struggle, she grabbed a heavy candlestick and struck him. I thought he'd get up. I thought he'd yell at me, curse at me, but he just lay there. Her voice broke, and she paused, the memory visibly painful. "I didn't mean to kill him. I swear I didn't." I sat there in stunned silence, unsure how to respond. But it didn't end there. She told me how, in a panic, she dragged his body down to the basement and hid it, intending to call the police. But in her fear and shock, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Days turned into weeks, and somehow, she convinced herself to keep the secret. Eventually, she met my grandfather, and they fell in love. But Henry's body was still there, hidden behind a false wall she'd constructed in the basement. All these years, she'd lived with that burden, hiding it from everyone, even my grandfather. "Promise me," she whispered, clutching my hand even tighter. "Promise me you won't let anyone know." But as the days passed after her death, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew I couldn't live with that knowledge, that secret festering inside me. So, a few days after the funeral, I went back to the house alone. I made my way to the basement, every step echoing with my grandmother's voice in my mind. The basement was dark, colder than I remembered. In the corner, I found the old, rotting wooden wall she'd built, barely holding up after all these years. With shaking hands, I pried it open, and as the light hit what was behind it, I realized just how much of my family's history had been built on lies. But there was no body. Instead, there were letters, hundreds of them, all written by Henry, detailing a different story. According to him, Grandma had never wanted to let him go. In his letters, he described how she'd manipulated and threatened him, claiming she'd make him disappear if he ever left her. Each letter was darker than the last, painting her as someone I barely recognized. As I read through them, a chill crept over me. I realized there was another truth to the story, one Grandma had taken to her grave. She hadn't killed Henry in self-defense. She'd done it out of jealousy and rage. And my grandfather, the man I'd loved and respected my whole life, had known the truth all along. The entire family legacy, everything I thought I knew, had been built on a twisted lie. That night, I burned the letters, one by one. Grandma had always said some secrets were best left buried, and now I understood why. This story, with its twists and unsettling revelations, uses suspense and mystery to keep the reader invested throughout. It's structured to deliver periodic hooks to re-engage interest, ideal for a long-form Reddit story.